Korea is this thingy hanging off the side of East Asia. A peninsula with many mountains and large rivers, such as the northern Yalu River, the massive central Han River, and the long southern Nakdong River. Since ancient times, Korea has been home to many different unique types of animals, and also people.
죄송합니다, 여러분.
The story of Korean civilization starts with the explosive use of farming in the Bronze Age. The first large and unified Korean state was the state of Gojoseon. Gojoseon means Old Joseon, as Joseon is a Korean state that would exist later along the line. We know Gojoseon had a long existence, but just as with its neighbor China, there's a lot of uncertainty about which elements of this civilization were mythical. For a reign that lasted more than 2,000 years, it's quite astonishing that we really only know about 4 Gojoseon kings. Gojoseon had seen many Chinese states come and go. The Xia, the Shang, the Zhou, the Qin, and near the end of its existence it even witnessed and fought the mighty Han dynasty. In the south of the peninsula, there was a confederation of towns and cities called the Jin. To the east there was a group of islands that was populated by humans, where large-scale farming had also begun to spring up. Eventually, the kingdom of Gojoseon began to become more and more unstable, as its government officials began fighting each other for power. And so the Korean peninsula became a divided mess, until states were conquered and unified to form 3 main states: the northern kingdom of Goguryeo, the western Baekje, and the eastern state of Silla. There was also a smaller state named Gaya, which held out for quite some time before being annexed by Silla. Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla are the states referred to by the term Free Kingdoms era, and it was in this Free Kingdoms era that Buddhism happened to arrive. Nice. Baekje controlled a large and fertile part of the mighty Han River, and thus had a strategic advantage. But the army of the northern Goguryeo was quite strong, and they managed to push the southern kingdoms back. At this point, it was a no-brainer for Baekje and Silla to form an alliance against the much stronger Goguryeo. Together, they managed to reclaim a lot of land, but it was Silla that ended up capturing the most land, and controlling the mighty Han River, and thus gained the upper hand on Baekje. Baekje was frustrated at Silla for becoming too almighty, and thus launched an invasion. Now Silla had a bit of a problem, because there was no way they could fight off Goguryeo and Baekje at the same time. So they turned eastward for help. To the east of Korea, the island group, now known as Wa, was ruled by the Yamato kingships. But they turned down their request for aid and remained allied to Baekje. So Silla turned to China instead. At this point, the Tang dynasty ruled over China, and the Tang emperor was more than happy to help Silla, as the Tang had tried to invade Goguryeo before anyways. The deal the Tang and Silla had made involved splitting up the peninsula along the Taedong River, with Silla ruling over the lands to the south of the river, and the Tang setting up the Andong Protectorate in the north. The Tang invaded Goguryeo by land and sent ships to invade Baekje by sea, and together they came out victorious. The Tang were ambitious, however, and quickly began trying to strengthen their grip on Silla, and even began setting up military bases in Silla's territory. Luckily for Silla, it eventually ended up strengthening itself to the point that it could become fully independent from the Tang dynasty, in part due to the embracing of the refugees from the formerly defeated kingdoms of Baekje and Goguryeo. The Andong Protectorate gradually disappeared, and Silla was left alone for quite a while. Eventually, a new northern state called Parae was formed. This state comprised of many different refugees and nomadic peoples, such as the Mohe people, the Han Chinese, the Goguryeo people, Uyghur people, and Shiwei people. The diversity made the state quite difficult to govern, and at times rather unstable. Parae suffered badly when it was invaded by the nomadic Khitan people. The Khitan people are known for having formed the Liao dynasty in northern China. But come on, they're really known for these dope-ass haircuts. Look at this. Oh my god. While Parae was falling apart, Silla also wasn't doing too hot, as its nobles began focusing on obtaining personal wealth and power instead of serving the people. It's no wonder that Silla broke apart to form another three kingdoms, later Goguryeo, later Baekje, and of course still Silla. Later Goguryeo had a king called Gungye, who was a Buddhist extremist and a tyrant. He supposedly did actually look like this, which makes it a lot more believable to me that he was so evil. Luckily, Gungye was overthrown by Wang Gon, who took the throne and in 918 created the state of Goryeo. This state would then conquer the southern kingdoms and form a unified state that would exist from 936 to 1392. Doesn't Goryeo sound familiar? It's where we get the modern name Korea from. Goryeo was also a much more stable state than Silla ever was, and they're known for their trade with distant Arab nations. There was one notable hiccup during Goryeo's existence, however. Its ruling class had gotten very divided, with the civil officials, the Munshin, looking down on the military officials, the Mushin. The Mushin realized they could easily take control, and so the Mushin Rebellion began in 1117, in which the Mushin took control of the government and kept the king as nothing more than a figurehead. Goryeo's military had been effective against northern invaders, such as the Khitans and the Jurchens, later known as the Manchus. But from 1231 to 1270, Goryeo had to face a different kind of threat. In the steppes of Mongolia, Genghis Khan managed to unite the Mongol tribes to form an expansive state that made excellent use of horses to conquer a massive piece of Eurasia. The empire grew and grew, and eventually it kind of just had to fall apart. And this eastern part, known as the Yuan dynasty, became Goryeo's new headache. Goryeo was conquered and forced to become a loyal vassal state to the Mongols, so the Mongols were effectively in charge. The Mongols famously used Korea as a landing ground to invade Japan. This went horribly, in part due to the unfortunate timing of a big typhoon. So they soon tried again, but it went pretty badly again, in part due to another typhoon. So they didn't try that again. The Mongol Yuan dynasty eventually began to fall apart, and it was the Ming dynasty that defeated it in the struggle for China. Goryeo was thus, once again, an independent state. But a group in the ruling class of Goryeo, called the Gwanmun Sejok, was quite bitter about the Yuan dynasty leaving, mainly because they had profited from their rule, and so they blamed the Ming for toppling the Mongols. So when the Ming sent a delegate to Goryeo, he was assassinated by Gwanmun Sejok, infuriating the Ming dynasty, which saw this as an excellent excuse to start a war with Goryeo. The Ming claimed a bunch of Goryeo's northern lands, and it's about time we talk about who was in charge of Goryeo. Goryeo's king was King U. King U had a loyal and respected general called Choyong. Choyong himself commanded over another general called Yi Songye. Yi Songye was famous for previously defeating a group of Japanese pirates, which earned him a lot of praise. Choyong saw the claims the Ming made as absurd and planned to invade the Chinese-held Liaodong Peninsula. But King Wu didn't want to risk losing Choyong and asked him to stay by his side. Choyong agreed and simply sent Yi Songye instead. But Yi Songye really didn't think the expedition would be a good idea, mainly because when the Chinese Sui dynasty had tried to invade Goguryeo ages ago, the Goguryeo generals had the dams of the Salsi River breached, which completely destroyed the Sui army. He knew it was the rainy season and the rivers would be very unpredictable. Yi Songye tried to convince his superior Choyong that it was a bad idea, but Choyong insisted and gave him command of the entire Goryeo army. So Yi Songye set out, but he quickly saw his fears being confirmed when many of his men drowned at the Yalu River, mainly due to a rainstorm setting in as the army was trying to cross. Yi Songye realized this expedition was going to be his death, so he decided to turn back to the capital and stage a risky coup. Seeing that he did have control over the entire army, he quite easily took control of Goryeo, executing Choyong and removing King U from the throne. He then had King Chang, King Wu's son, rise to the throne, but he kept him as nothing more than a puppet. So now Yi Songye ruled over Goryeo, but he wasn't really sure what to do with the nation. In 1392, Yi Songye made himself king, and was later given the temple name, aka the name you get after your death, of Taejo. He would form a new nation called Joseon. Remember that first Korean nation? Joseon had an incredibly long and stable reign. It also had an awesome flag that looks like the modern South Korean flag on steroids. But wait a second, what happened to all that land that the Ming claimed? Didn't the war go on? Well, Joseon managed to establish peaceful relations with the Ming, and the Ming even aimed to have Joseon as a trustworthy, peaceful vassal state. A large part of the information we know about the Joseon period comes from a collection of records that were held throughout the country's existence. These records described every part of Joseon society. The king himself wasn't even allowed to read it, and is thus a very trustworthy source. King Taejo wished to make one of his sons that he had with his second wife the new king, but they were both murdered by Yi Bang-won, a disgruntled son of Taejo's first wife. Yi Bang-won's brother became king, but soon abdicated to leave the throne to Yi Bang-won, who became the new king, Taejong. Taejong, though having murdered his way into power, was quite a good ruler, but not as good as his own son, Sejong. Sejong is generally regarded as the best king Korea ever had. He was a ruler with a warm heart, and his policies show this. Korea had always had a strong social hierarchy in which the lowest class, the nobi, were enslaved. Sejong reformed the laws regarding slaves in order to give nobi mothers 3 months of maternity leave instead of just a week. He also strengthened the governmental system and helped many scientific breakthroughs come about, such as the new standardized rain gauge and a portable sundial. He also secretly worked on a new writing system for the Korean language. We're quite sure he made it in secret, because those historical records I mentioned earlier never describe him working on it until it was actually revealed. The new writing system known as Hangul is still in use today, and I've been using it throughout this video. Up until that point, Korean had been written using Chinese characters. This was impossible to learn for anyone who wasn't a noble. The letters of Hangul stack together very logically, and it's thus very easy to write down important things such as the laws the people need to be able to read. Even I kinda got the hang of it. So Joseon was flourishing, but things were soon about to change for the worse, as Joseon's eastern neighbor went through a big change. Japan had been a divided jumble of states until a clan of samurai managed to unite the country. Their leader was the ambitious Toyotomi Hideyoshi. He led the Toyotomi clan and envisioned himself conquering Korea in order to conquer the Ming dynasty. He first attempted simply asking Joseon for military access, but Joseon obviously said no, in part due to the fact that Joseon was a vassal state to the Ming dynasty. So in 1592, the Imjin War started. The Japanese landed at Busan and fought their way up the peninsula. Both sides made increasing use of firearms and artillery throughout the Imjin War. And Joseon is especially known for using these turtle boat-looking things. They were covered in spikes, and they had a dragon head that spewed actual flaming oil. They were incredibly effective, and I just needed to mention these little guys. Toyotomi got so far north that he almost started a war with the Jurchens. He was then driven off the peninsula by Joseon, that was heavily aided by the Ming. Toyotomi tried again with another southern invasion, but got much less far before being repelled. The Imjin War had been incredibly devastating for Joseon, and left them vulnerable to an attack by the newly formed Jurchen Jin dynasty. The Jurchens, which I will now be referring to as Manchus, formed a new dynasty called the Qing. This Qing dynasty also invaded Joseon and forced it into coercion as a loyal vassal state. The Imjin War had weakened the Ming, and they were very easily conquered by the Qing. The Manchus and their Qing dynasty now ruled over the entirety of China. Meanwhile, in Japan, Toyotomi Hideyoshi died after the war. But first he had arranged for 5 powerful men to take care of the country until his son would be old enough to rule. Then he did actually die, and these 5 men had other plans. One of these men, Tokugawa Ieyasu, was by far the most powerful, and didn't care to let Toyotomi's son rule. a loyal advisor of Toyotomi called Ishida Mitsunari opposed his rule, and so there was a civil war, which Tokugawa won. Tokugawa then went on to form the Tokugawa shogunate, which was a strict samurai-run state that completely closed off Japan from the outside world. This kept Japan outside of the picture for Korea for quite a while. It's important to mention that the shogun was the military leader of Japan, and Japan did have an emperor, but he was just a ceremonial dude and didn't really do anything. Joseon was also fairly closed off from the world under the oversight of the Qing. They paid tribute to the Qing and spent 200 years rebuilding their nation and flourishing. Their tribute to the Qing was becoming more and more ceremonial. And then the Western powers showed up. These Western powers had been industrializing and building an empire for themselves. So when the British clobbered the Qing in the Opium Wars, they were more than happy to jump in and take advantage of the weakened China. Joseon was no different and quickly found itself getting hassled and forced to sign unequal treaties. The Americans were the first to get to Japan, and they made use of a special type of diplomacy in which you use heavily armed ships to get your way, beautifully named gunboat diplomacy. The Americans thus broke the isolation, and the Tokugawa shogunate was subjected to the wrath of foreign domination. But it wouldn't take too long. Remember that Japan also had an emperor? That emperor fought the Tokugawa shogunate in a civil war and won. His name was Emperor Meiji, and in 1868 he officially restored the imperial power. He wanted an industrialized Japan that wouldn't lag behind on the Western countries. And what did all of these Western countries have? That's right, an empire. So Japan was gonna get one. In 1876, the Japanese used its new shiny gunboats to force Joseon into signing the Treaty of Ganghwa. The treaty ended Korea's isolation to Japan and opened its ports to Japanese traders. 1894 saw a peasant uprising in Joseon. Joseon requested aid from China to put the rebellion down. The Qing agreed, and Japan saw this as a perfect excuse to attack China and further assert its control over Korea. This Sino-Japanese war was a particularly bitter pill for the Chinese people, as Japan had always been an inferior nation. Now Japan had defeated them, and took the Liaodong Peninsula and the island of Taiwan for themselves. Meanwhile in Joseon, King Gojong knew something had to change in order to prevent the total domination of Korea by Japan. So in 1897, King Gojong proclaimed the new Empire of Korea. This empire wasn't necessarily an empire, but it was an attempt at a fresh start. Emperor Gojong tried to modernize the country, in part by trying to remove the old social hierarchy and thus abolishing slavery. He also attempted to improve the country's infrastructure by giving it new railways, phone lines, and roads. He even reached out to foreign powers to form some sort of alliance, but at this point no one was interested in being allied to Korea, as pretty much everyone had accepted that Korea laid in Japan's sphere of influence. Yet there was one country Japan was worried about when it came to controlling Korea. Russia had taken advantage of a weakened China to advance into Manchuria. They now owned the Manchu Home province, but seemed eager to advance into the Liaodong Peninsula in order to have a warm water port. Japan attempted to negotiate the crisis, but Russia really didn't see it as its equal. Japan wanted to be seen as a great power, and they saw this disrespect as a sign that it was time to assert their control in the region. So from 1904 till 1905, the Japanese fought the Russians for Korea, the Liaodong Peninsula, and the island of Sakhalin. What didn't help for Russia is that it was falling apart and would eventually be replaced by the Soviet Union. The Japanese won the Russo-Japanese War and made sure to have the Russians leave Manchuria and take the south of the island of Sakhalin for themselves. Korea had been briefly occupied by Japan during the war. And 1905 was a particularly dark year for Korean independence, as Japan had Korean officials sign yet again another wave of humiliating treaties, which pretty much gave Japan the power to rule Korea. It would take until 1910 for Japan to officially annex Korea, and its years as a full-blown colony of the Empire of Japan were ready to begin. The Japanese wanted to completely eliminate the Korean culture, and they started with the Korean language, replacing it with Japanese wherever they could. They also tried to force Shintoism on the Korean people. They drafted nearly 250,000 young Korean men into the Japanese military. And most disturbingly, they forced thousands of women and girls into sexual slavery as comfort women. And they also enforced last name changes. Now, of course, many Koreans were frustrated about what had happened to their country. So in 1919, there was a widespread Korean uprising, known as the March 1st movement. It was a mostly peaceful protest, but the Japanese military made sure to crack down on the protest with exceptional violence. With all of this oppression, you might be wondering why the Qing weren't getting involved. Well, at this point, the Qing really weren't a thing anymore. In 1912, the last emperor, Emperor Puyi, who was a 6-year-old, was deposed. This sent China down a brief democratic path before immediately crashing into a state of chaos. This era is known as the Warlord era, and it's known for its many independent warlords who all fought each other, and it's an incredibly complicated conflict. But this video is about Korea, and so all you need to know is the closest thing China had to a central government was the Nationalist Party, which generally held the most power. They were also Japan's next target. In 1931, a bomb blew up a Japanese train in Manchuria. This was an excuse for Japan to launch an invasion of Manchuria and kick the nationalists out. Then in 1937, there was a shootout near the Marco Polo Bridge. This triggered the Second Sino-Japanese War. This war coincided with the Japanese joining the Axis in the Second World War and proceeding to take a massive amount of territory in Asia. The Japanese invasion of China and the rest of Asia showed an interesting difference between the way the Japanese occupied its previous colonies and how it occupied its new ones. In Korea and Taiwan, the locals were seen as unfit to govern, but there was an attempt at improving infrastructure, scientific knowledge, and literacy. The Japanese mistreated the Koreans as humans, but they mistreated the Chinese as animals. The future for Korea seemed bleak under Japanese rule. Until the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the United States and the rapid invasion of Manchuria by the Soviet Union happening in 4 days was enough for Japan to surrender. Both the Soviet Union and the US rushed into Korea in order to set up their own preferred Korean state. And they both agreed to split the Korean peninsula on the 38th parallel of the Earth. In the northern half, the Soviets set up the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which was an incredibly communist state ruled by dictator Kim Il-sung. In the southern part, the Americans set up the Republic of Korea, which was a very capitalist and staunchly anti-communist state, which was ruled by dictator Syngman Rhee. Now, the situation was obviously not a stable one, and it wouldn't take long before the Koreas would start fighting each other. It's generally acknowledged that the North Koreans fired the first shot, but the North Koreans claim there was a South Korean invasion which was repelled so efficiently that no evidence could ever be found. Nice. The North Koreans advanced rapidly, taking the South Korean capital of Seoul. Meanwhile, the Americans landed and tried to hold out in Busan, where the United Nations hastily also landed troops to defend South Korea. The Americans launched a risky landing at Incheon. This disrupted the North Koreans, which pushed them back. Seoul was recaptured, and the Americans pushed onwards to take the North Korean capital of Pyongyang. It's at this point that we really need to talk about China. Right after Japan was busy being blown up, China resumed a civil war between the Nationalist and Communist Party. The Communists won, while the Nationalists were forced to flee to Taiwan. China was now very communist, supported the Soviet Union and North Korea, and hated the United States. So it made perfect sense for them to join the war on North Korea's side. With this newfound aid from the Chinese, the North Koreans recaptured their own capital, and soon took the South Korean capital as well. The US and its allies regained their composure, retook Seoul, and ended up in a stalemate. Eventually, both sides would agree to an armistice, and they split North and South Korea up with a new border which had its very own demilitarized zone, managed by the United Nations. Both Koreas were dirt-poor nations, but North Korea was slightly better off in the initial years. But from the 1960s onward, South Korea experienced an economic miracle. North Korea could not match this economic growth. This was already embarrassing enough, but when the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s, North Korea had a big problem. Without Soviet support, the economy collapsed, and they experienced a terrible famine in the same decade. The difference in development between the two nations kept growing and growing. And South Korea experienced a very strange new phenomenon. As South Korean people got to experience more welfare, freedom, and competition, the incentive to start a family kind of disappeared, and South Korea's fertility rate plummeted to the lowest in the world, forming an existential threat of its own. South Korea's allies consist of the United States, its European allies, and even Japan, even though it's quite a rough relationship. North Korea still has its traditional neighbors of China and Russia as its best allies. Both Koreas hold impressive standing armies, mainly due to the fact that they're still technically at war. And North Korea even possesses an impressive nuclear arsenal. North Korea is incredibly isolated, while South Korea is incredibly globalized. North Korea has in its 80 years of existence interestingly only had 3 leaders: Kim Il-sung, his son Kim Jong-il, and his grandson Kim Jong-un. South Korea dictated along for another 40 years after its founding. Eventually it became a democracy, and this did lead to there being way more leaders in South Korea than in North Korea, with the counter set at 14 presidents today. South Korea gave the world K-pop. North Korea gave us this masterpiece. With all of this information, Korea seems like a massive social experiment. But it's important to strip away the chaos and the division and remember that the Korean peninsula has been divided and reunited before. And I like to keep hope for a peaceful reunification of the Korean people in the future. Thank you very much for making it to the end of the video. I don't know how you did it. It was a longer run, so thank you and have a great day. If you already had a day, then I hope your day was great. And